Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
And we are at episode 43. And today we're going to talk about the boss your therapist knows all about.
Yeah. I see. Initially, when I read that, I thought that this was what you were saying is the boss, the therapist that your boss has recommended you go to, because of course that's happened to me. So I had to channel it through my own thing. I had to reread it to figure out what we meant. But both work for me.
Yeah. So to clarify, this is about the boss that is so, I don't like the word triggering. I prefer the word activating. The boss that is so activating to you, the one that pushes all of your buttons that you end up talking about this person repeatedly in therapy or with your friends or in executive coaching sessions or wherever it is that you process those things, right? And that's what we're talking about. It's like, because I actually had a boss like this when I was in therapy for many years. And my therapist knew all about the boss, knew the guy's name, knew what he did, knew why, and because it would come up so frequently. And what I thought that was interesting about that is there's two ways that we could go with this episode, right? We are called the Bad Boss Brief. So we could talk about bad bosses and how to psychologically manage working for somebody who is gaslighting you, who's a racist, who's sexist. But that's really been the other 42 episodes that we've done, and our archive is free and available. So we thought we'd try something different. We thought we would talk about, what about a boss who activates you who is not a bad boss?
Yeah.
What do you do in a circumstance where you have a decent person who is your manager, they're relatively skillful, but you are intensely activated because they remind you of your abusive alcoholic father?
Yeah. Well, and before we get too far afield, I'd like to say, based on something you just said about your therapist heard all about your boss, partners. If you want to know if you're a pain in the ass in the workplace, at your holiday party, see how your coworkers, partners respond to you. I had a boss who, admittedly now, 25 years later, I can admit I was probably a massive pain in his ass. And when I met his wife, I could tell that precisely I had been a topic of conversation at dinner more than once. So I'd like to say me culpa, but fuck him. So anyway, yes.
Yes. And so, I think what's interesting about this situation is it happens more often than people realize, right? Like I intentionally don't talk about my executive coaching clients in public, including this show. But I have said to many individuals, this person keeps coming up.
Yeah.
Right? And I notice when a person keeps coming up, and it's not around a skill, it's not around, any particular topic that is part of our work together. And I think what's interesting is, so just to step back for a second, executive coaches are very careful about having a very bright line that we are not therapists.
Right. All right.
We can ethically suggest that our clients go to therapy. We might suggest that some of these things are outside of the purview of an executive coaching session. But even coaching friends that I have who were therapists are very clear about where that line is. But one of the questions that I will ask friends and clients is, does this situation that you're concerned about remind you of anything from your past? Right? Just to sort of set up a question. Is this reminiscent? Is this reminiscent of a previous relationship, a parent, a sibling, an ex, is something that was challenging in your life? Are there dynamics that are being played out? And to sort of get curious about that.
As you well know, I'm completely obsessed with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I've competed, and I found that there's something that I started to do very much along those lines. At the beginning of the competition, the referee says, go, fight. And I would face palm my competitor, literally put my hand on their face and push. And what I found is that if the person had what you're suggesting, difficult early life experiences, that this was triggering, like massively. And the benefit to me is it would trigger them so much so that they would have probably intense 40 seconds of rage, which would tire them out before they could regain their composure. Also, on the other side, there are people who I would do that to, and they would have no response at all. And these were people typically who had had it done so often that it wasn't a factor for them. And these were typically the wrestlers. So, but now we're getting into the weeds. So, what I like about this is, and I think you pretty much suggested it without saying so, that this is less about bad bosses and more about your bad responses to bosses, which I think is pretty compelling. Right.
And I think that the challenge is that you can get into a real trap. If you are activated by someone, our natural human response is to blame the person who is activating you.
Correct.
Right? So those stories that are being told, whether it's to a therapist or a spouse, are generally going to be, that asshole did this thing. Right? And it's going to be about the perceived injustices, unfairness. There's going to be very specific narratives. And almost always the narratives, particularly initially, are going to focus on what the boss, in this case, did that was wrong, unjust, unskillful, whatever. A lot of people just stop there. And what that means is that they are vulnerable to use your example, they're vulnerable to that face plant.
Yeah.
Right? Because, and I'm assuming good intention in the case of these bosses, that I'm sure there are bosses that do the work equivalent of the face plant, that will do something aggressive to a direct report to gauge their emotional stability. Not talking about that bad boss today, talking about good bosses. But it opens you up, right? Because if if you don't understand history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Yep.
Right. So there's a couple of questions that I think are useful to look at if you are continuing to have a question or challenges with a particular individual. Shall I jump into them?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay. So the first thing is, if you are activated by something that someone is doing, whether it's a pattern or a one-off, first try to step back and say, if Stephanie and Eugene were sitting here watching this happen, would they immediately have the same response I am having?
Yeah.
Right? Because there are certainly plenty of things that you and I have seen that instantly we can be like, that's dysfunctional, that's inappropriate, that's abusive. If we wouldn't get it, if we were third-person observers, if other people in your work group or who also interact with these individuals are not having the same response, they don't find this person to have those same difficulties, that's the first thing that is a clue that what you are reacting to might be more about your past than the existence of what's happening in the moment.
Yeah, I recall we did a photo shoot with an actress for the Men's Style magazine I used to be editor-in-chief of. And, these were typically multi-hour affairs, 12-hour, 10-hour photo shoots. We have a stylist and, the makeup person. And the woman came in, had her own stylist, came in styled, right? It was nothing needed to be done. And my stylist, this great guy named Tim, she's sitting in the chair and looks at her and goes, "Oh, you look great. You look perfect." And as a way of parting, in the way that you might shake hands with somebody or pat somebody on the shoulder, he kind of took her hair and just kind of go, like, "Oh, it's perfect." Like literally just, I was standing there, saw his fingers kind of brush, like it was brushing lint, something out of her hair. And she started sobbing. And at this point, Tim looks at me, and it's just the whole Hollywood, the secondary language of Hollywood. I kind of indicate that he should leave. And then I say, as editor-in-chief, I go, "You know what? Maybe today is not the best day to finish this photo shoot. Maybe we could do it some other time," which I really don't want. $16,000 photo shoot. I can't have this go another day. But clearly something was, this had nothing to do with this photo shoot. It was something else entirely. And for the next 40 minutes, I had to handle it, you know? So,
Well, and that's actually a really skillful example of what to do if you're on the flip side of this, right? If
yeah.
you are
Yeah.
a boss who is intentional, showing up in a well-regulated, skillful manner, and you are finding that the person that works for you is activated in a way that is inexplicable to you, that's
Yeah.
actually a really good example, right? Like the stylist gesture was innocuous. It was like wiping lint for some reason that activated this person extremely. If you're in that situation, take a pause, step away, and just give them a minute to regain their composure. So from the other side of it, that's really skillful. I think that the next thing is if you have ascertained that the behavior that's happening isn't actually that extreme, it isn't maybe even actually that unskillful, be honest with yourself. If you have an ongoing dislike with your boss, what I want you to do is to think about what is your part. So imagine you've got a sheet of paper and it's divided in two. Most of us only focus on filling out the column about all the things that our boss did that we hate. We put a lot of detail mentally and emotionally into all the things our boss did wrong. Rarely do we look at the other side of the column to ways in which we could have been more skillful, right? So what's in the column that's my part, right? Am I showing up to meetings with somebody I don't like, radiating disapproval?
Right.
Am I treating my boss's comments and suggestions as optional or with disdain? Am I showing up late? Am I doing half-assed work? Am I talking trash about the boss to other people? Right? Generally, when we are in a contentious situation with anybody, boss or coworker, there's always something on the other side of the page. And until we look at that, we are not in a position, we're not accurately assessing what it is that's happening.
Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is pretty much in a nutshell. Is it me? Is it them? Is it me? It's them? Is it me? You know, I mean, and this is good to ask at any given point.
And there are going to be some cultural and gender-based stereotypes that you need to be aware of. Often women will tend to assume that everything is their fault and that they are responsible for everybody's, like feeling okay. And is their boss all right? It must be me. Often middle-aged white men, my favorite allusion to make, are going to assume it's somebody else's problem, right? It's this, it's this crazy person. It's this whatever. So, it's useful to maybe check these findings with somebody. Again, rather than saying to your spouse for the 150th time, here's what that jerk did to me, maybe say to your spouse, is there anything that I've said about my behavior or patterns that you know about me that could be contributing to the challenges that I'm having with my boss?
I'm going to have to shit on that as a piece of advice.
Okay, tell me why. Tell me why.
Because, I mean, listen, you have people at home very specifically to root for they're your cheerleaders, to root for the home team. That's like Pandora's box. Is there anything that you could think of that I do here that pisses you off that might be pissing off my boss? Yeah, and so now I have two arguments. So I know I would never ever do this. So, but I understand how it might be good advice for some. But I want to keep the cheerleading going on, and I don't want this also to be and another thing you do, and I got to get it at work, and I got to get it at home. No, I can't have this. So I can't fight a two battle war here. So
I understand that perspective. However, on the other side of it, and what happens in my home. Now, keep in mind, my husband is in the unfortunate position of being a senior leader who is married to an executive coach. Right. Which I would not wish on anybody. I mean, I try to be like, do you want advice? So, you're not wrong in that regard. However, let's be realistic. A lot of people who are partnered, particularly if they are sharing any kind of finances, right? Even if they split the bills down the middle, we are invested in our partner's success. We are invested in our partner's financial stability. And I think that there are skillful ways for that question to be asked. You're not saying, what are the things that drive you crazy about me as a spouse? What you're saying is, based on your intimate knowledge of me and your understanding of my situation at work, is there anything I might be missing? This is not gonna be a fight. This is not gonna be I really want to understand because I heard this podcast that says I should look at my part.
Yeah.
That if your spouse is skillful, your spouse may say something like, well, you have mentioned that your boss is very much has an attention to detail. And honey, we both know that's not your strength. So could there be anything that you could do to make sure that you're being as organized as possible?
Right.
That's not particularly incendiary. Usually people who are not organized or who are chronically
I would respond negatively to that. And it is like, so what are you trying to say? Wait, lack of attention to detail. I'm very detailed. I would push back and resist. So, but yes, this is for other people, not just for me.
other people. For those who find it might be useful, then that would be, because the challenge is, I think the fundamental problem here is that our society has shifted in ways that cut us off from feedback we would have gotten naturally, right? So I come from a large Italian family, and there are plenty of aunts and uncles who are going to tell me what I've done wrong, with or without me asking, right? So I have grown up in a cultural milieu where older people are going to tell me to get my shit together, right? And there's a place for that. They're usually right, except about politics where we don't agree. But that idea of like you need to behave a certain way is, and there used to be religious communities. There used to be, like neighbors, people live more closely to their families. And so what can happen is sometimes we can fall into ways of being unskillful. Maybe, it's like the person who finds themselves over time spending most of their day looking at their phone.
Yeah.
Right. In my family, somebody's going to take the phone and be like, you need to put that down and talk to your child right now.
Yeah. Right.
But if we don't have those kinds of relationships, if our brother or aunt or whoever it is that's going to tell us that truth isn't sitting across from us, our toddler is going to be sitting there playing because mom or dad's on the phone. Right. And so I guess what I'm looking at is that where we do not have culturally built-in feedback loops, people who have permission or the guts to tell us the difficult things we need to understand about ourselves, we are going to be limited socially in our ability to be as skillful as we can in our personal and work relationships, right? So if like Eugene, you have other vehicles and other vectors for people to tell you the truth.
Right.
I know I certainly have told you the truth upon occasion. And it doesn't, and maybe that doesn't come from your spouse or your mom or whatever, but as long as we have somebody in our life who can say to us, hey, you need to face insert uncomfortable truth here, I really think that we're going to be limited.
Well, what works best for me is the Socratic method. If people say, do you think it makes sense, or do you a way to put it would be that would help me, do you think it's going to be advantageous to your career that you show up with no pants to work? No accusations, they're just saying, do you think, given that I know you've thought about this, you choosing to not wear pants to work is going to be a professional issue for you? And I could say yes, or I could say no, but what am I going to rail against? Just a question. It's just a question, right? So, and believe me, this wasn't an issue with me necessarily, but this was a real workplace issue at Apple Computer, which prized itself on probably the spear point in everybody getting rid of business casual even, and in the engineering department, Steve Jobs didn't give a shit what you wore as long as you got the job done. And which, of course, there's going to be the guy who pushes it. And never saw this guy wear pants his entire time I was at Apple. But then, of course, he had shorts and a shirt and shoes and socks. Then he got rid of the shoes, got rid of socks, got rid of the shirt. And I'd be sitting there in the cafeteria at Apple watching this guy who had a completely not a beach ready body, walking around like almost naked. And then if it was a really hot day, there wouldn't even be cargo shorts. They would be like posing like Speedos. And finally, I said, I was sitting there grousing, somebody's got to talk. And finally, I could tell somebody talked to him because he was wearing pants and he looked aggrieved that he had to put on a shirt and pants. So,
So I think to go to the last piece of advice is, well, there's actually two. Like the first one is, are your expectations of your boss realistic?
right.
So, in that column, right, where you're looking at your part, a lot of times I'll see this where people just have completely unrealistic expectations of the people that they work with, right? So like you may feel very strongly that your boss needs to approve a particular line of budget that you feel is integral to your success. And the boss may not have that money. Right? They have a P&L to manage. They have bosses. Like sometimes you can't expect an introvert to show up like an extrovert at work, right? There are just certain things that are hardwired in people. And I think the question of, again, checking with yourself or a trusted advisor, are these realistic expectations? Right? Or is this kind of beyond the purview of a work relationship, or even if this person is mentoring you? And then the other thing is, if there are things that your boss is doing that are frustrating or damaging for you, have you actually addressed it with your boss, again, in a skillful way, right? And you want to use the I statements, but you could say something like, when you give me feedback in front of others, I feel singled out in a way that's hurtful. Would it be possible for us to cover any concerns or suggestions you have in one-on-ones?
Yeah.
Or the other thing is to ask questions, get curious. I see that Peter is going to the global conference this year. Instead of me, I have gone for the last 3 or 4 years. Can you help me understand a little bit more what went into that decision?
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Because the answer may be, hey, you are going to get a promotion, and I need you in the leadership team meeting to do a very important thing. And anybody can go to that conference and report back, I need you here. Right? So again, you want to be careful of the narratives that you are putting into sort of pressure test the narrative. You should be asking, what is happening? Help me understand. Let me get at what is actually going on.
And I would say, if you can frame that question, just the question, the way you said it, the way you spelled it out just now, if you're in the frame of mind to be able to frame that question, you've probably stepped back and gotten the perspective that you need to be able to put that into a sentence so that you can deliver it without seeming aggrieved or angry or upset, which means the chances of it being received well probably have increased, by significant percentage. So,
and right now, there's a lot of difficult things that are happening in the world, right? There's a very contentious election. There's a war in the Middle East. There are a lot of really tough things that are happening at work. I mean, in the world, which impacts people showing up at work. And so I think being really mindful of how balanced and centered do I feel?
right.
And do I need professional help? I mean, I am a fan of therapy. I was in therapy for a really long time. I think that there is a place for people who are just struggling, right? You don't have to be diagnosed with a mental illness. You don't have to be in some sort of crisis, but it's useful to just sort of check in. Do I need some outside help? And one of the ways to understand if the problem you have with the boss is partly attributed to you in your past is, do you keep having the same problem?
Yeah. You mean the same problem with the same boss, or the same
problem with different bosses? Is this a pattern? Is the thing you're saying about your boss the same thing you said about your last boss and the boss before, and what you said about your boyfriend in college, and what you said about, your dad when you were in high school? Often there is a through line that we can't see on our own. But if you stop and do a little self-reflection, are there commonalities, right?
Or that bumper sticker that says something akin to, if everyone if everyone you meet today is an asshole, maybe they're not the assholes. You know,
Right. You
something
know,
that's it really really helps me to think about actually. So
yeah, wherever you go, there you are.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
I think that and again, this isn't to try to say that conflict is yours to resolve. Again, I particularly want to be mindful of women who feel like they need to emotionally,
Mm,
overfunction for everybody around them. But I do think that there is something that can be very corrective about
yeah,
taking a hard look at yourself in repeated conflicts, because unless you can afford to get another job or quit or leave, often we are stuck with difficult coworkers or bosses who are
mm,
activating to us, who we can't go to HR about because they're not doing anything that's
all right.
actionable.
Yeah,
And, you're not going to change the other person. To really try to change yourself may be your best solution to at least some sort of peace until you
right.
can move on to something else.
And what we're talking about are those car rides that you would take as a kid, and your parents would say, "Stop touching Jimmy," and you would go, "Okay," and then Jimmy would be whining 30 seconds later. He's not touching me, but he would be like, "I'm not touching you. I'm not touching." So if you're really analyzing it and your boss has got honestly decent intent, yeah, yeah, maybe it's you, But if the guy is just kind of jigger, yeah, it may be time to get a new job. But I like the idea of starting at home base first because that's all you can do, really,
Right.
right?
And then once you've
Yeah.
once you've looked at your side of the street, then you at least have the perspective to accurately
Yeah.
assess what's happening on the other side of the street and then determine more effectively whether or not you should leave.
But I also use a percentage system, and that is if it deviates from comfortable percentages, then I start to worry. So probably about 50% of the bosses I've had have been great. I really liked. I can name them: Chris Golker at Apple, Louise Rogers at EQ Magazine. I can go down the list of really good, but and then maybe a third have been just there. Just bosses who are Dennis Escow, just there, nice guy, basically just there. And then there's that last percentage of really horrible bosses. And as long as this repeats itself cyclically, I don't really worry. Like if you're in a professional career long enough, when you get to the point where this boss is terrible, but if it hews to the percentage breakdown, then you realize I just got a bad one. I'll reach back into the barrel next job, get a better one. So yeah, I myself, I'm not a big enough fan of therapy to figure out I got to go deal with this because it's driving me crazy. As long as it sticks to what I found over the course of my entire career has been a pretty steadfast percentage breakdown, then I'm fine with it. So,
All right. Did you have a fire me for this episode?
well, this is a slight deviation, but we dish on this show, so we're gonna have a dish. So, one of the things that my company before last had won was an Emmy. And they won an Emmy for a TV show called Black Women Own the Conversation. This would be Aussie Media. Aussie Media had a high flying lawyer who looked at the deal with Oprah Winfrey Network and said it's a bad deal, should not be signed. Financial fraudster Carlos Watson, also former CEO, said, "Well, I like the deal. I'm going to take it anyway." And so they took it, put out a show, and it won an Emmy. It was never picked up again, and I never knew why. Well, Friday of last week, I was interviewed by the Columbia Journalism Review for an upcoming piece that they have on what happened, the many and multiple failures of Aussie media. And during the course of this 3-hour interview with Columbia Journalism Review, they revealed to me that because he had never come up, this is Watson, had never come up with a business case for why a man was the host of a TV show that won an Emmy called Black Women Own the Conversation. Oprah said, "Great, glad you won an Emmy, but let's get another host in there for the second season." And here is when he could have most used our sage advice, because then, according to this reporter, he proceeded to flip out on Oprah.
Wow.
Which is why there was no second season. And indeed, the guy who fashioned himself as a cross between Anderson Cooper and Oprah stopped even using that as a breakdown. Kenny Rogers said it best: you got to know when to hold it and know when to fold it. And if the occasion ever arises that you have a need to scream at somebody much more powerful than you are, stifle it. Just stifle it, because it's not going to work out in your favor. I've been thinking about that since they interviewed me. I was like, I would hope that you would be in better control of your emotions. I would really hope that I would never, ever make that tactical error. And on the one hand, some guy told me, you gotta have boundaries. You gotta have boundaries. You can't I understand all that, but this was among the many colossal errors that were made by that administration.
It's
the
Oprah
Aussie media.
Winfrey. I mean, the queen of the media universe in so many ways of all the people.
Yeah.
But I would also argue that this comes back to not understanding, not having the self-awareness to understand, like, clearly he was activated by something, right?
Yep.
Didn't have people in his life who could tell him, what are you doing, dude? It's a show about Black women. Get a Black woman to be the host. And also was there, and you could argue that someone who gets into as much trouble as Carlos got into, hypothetically, would probably use some help with regulation, with understanding why they have the outsized reactions that they have. I think that's the thing that happens a lot of times with a lot of the people that we talk about on the show, is there's that sort of like, who does this? It's like, well, people who do not have to be regulated, who have people put up with this kind of behavior, or who feel that they're entitled in some way, and the rest of us no, we can't get away with it.
Now, keep in mind, I didn't do the hardcore journalist thing. I've not gone to secondary source. I've not fact-checked this. It was a story I shared as an anecdote that was shared with me, but it hews enough to what I knew from the inside to seem quite realistic to me, and it actually blew me away. I don't think I've ever made that kind of massive tactical error. In other words, I've always known which side the bread was buttered on.
But there's more than that, right? I mean, the idea like he would not understand that a Black woman telling him, I think that there should be a different host for the show called Black Women Own the Conversation.
Yeah.
That would not be A, self-evident, or B, become clear to him quickly.
Yeah.
That shows a level of disconnect from just common sense, privilege. There's so many things that are tied into that I think,
I watched the show and I remember thinking, at some point he's going to provide a professional, personal business case for why he's the host of it. It's like that thing they say in acting class: if you drop something on stage, pick it up. If you know you dropped something on stage, don't act like it didn't drop on stage. You got to be in the moment. So this idea that he was going to be a host and had it come up for a reason as to why. Simple question: why is he the host? At some point, I got 8 sisters. You would have to come up with some business, professional, personal case for why you were suited to. And Oprah could shoot it down still, but at least you would have had your say. The fact that there was nothing planned, is mind-boggling to me.
Oh my goodness! All right,
so that's me dishing. So.
That's you dishing, which is there's a place for dish. There's a place for dish.
Yeah.
So that's it for today's episode. If you have any ideas for upcoming shows, WTF@badbossbrief.com. I read every email that we get and would love some ideas of some future episodes. And again, follow us, tell your friends, let other people know about this. And if you are interested in hearing more about the bosses being bad, that's 42 episodes in the archives that will, give you more of that information. So until next time, see ya.
Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, worst case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.